So a huge welcome to this first roundtable. This is a opening of the Social Outcome Conference. It's the first official session. The keynote will be after this session to make sure that we are on a time zone that is a sociable hour for those who join us from all over the world. But welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government. Welcome to the Social Outcome Conference, to those who are here joining in Oxford, and to the many people who are joining online. For those online, good afternoon or good evening, if it's more appropriate for you. We have, this session is being recorded like all the sessions at the conference, and it will be made available online to revisit and listen if you want to take more notes and you want to share the insight you have here. If you are here on Zoom, already said, you're very welcome to interact with the chat, but make sure you're muted and your speakers are off at the same time. Throughout the session, you are welcome to ask questions in the chat, and I will stop at regular points to welcome questions from the room and go to questions that are in the chat as well. So we will stop 3 or 4 times and also at the end. For those of you on Zoom, you're very welcome to introduce yourself, say who you are, where you're calling from, what is your expertise, what you expect from the conference, so we know who is here. For anything around what's happening, the organization of the conference, go online to the program. Everything is posted there. The outline of the talks, the bios of the speaker is your Bible and is your compass over these 2 days. The GoLab team is also visible online on Zoom, and they should have a GoLab tag next to their name. It would be great if those on Zoom say name, surname, and the organization they're from on their Zoom profile, so we know more about you. I'm done with housekeeping, so let us start the session today. Today we are talking about measurements and the concept of public value and how these, what are the experience on the ground. It's a very rich session. We have a lot of speakers lined up. I have 4 speakers here and 4 speakers online, actually more because some speakers do a double act. And we are covering 9 countries. So we will go to experience from the UK, the US, Finland, India, Australia. I don't have a representative of Africa, but I'm really looking forward to comments in the chat for people who can bring experience from Africa. I know that we are missing it, but we have Colombia and Chile here as well from Mathilde, who is based in France, but she studied programs in Colombia and Chile as well as Reggie from Japan. So we are really covering the globe. We have a big gap in Africa. I'm counting of you on Zoom to reach out and talk to us about your experience. Because there are so many frameworks to talk about public value and how do you measure outcome. All the outcome-based approach requires somehow a measurement of outcomes. And it's very, very difficult for anybody who tried. It's great in principle, but then when you go to operationalize it, how do you measure it? Many of the things with value are difficult to measure. And there is always a fear that unless you measure it, it doesn't happen. Or it happens in principle and then life happens and well, it's not measured anyway. And so it's really, really important to have a good framework. And we have experience from all over the world. And the way we decided to structure the session is to kick us off with the theoretical framework. Among our speakers, we have Mathilde Pellizzari, to whom I will give the word at the beginning. She's doing, she's a DPhil candidate and also a practitioner. She is based at FAIR in France, the Impact Invest Lab, for those who knew the Impact Invest Lab in France before. And in her PhD, she's been looking at the value frameworks and how you would define value and how the definition and measurement of value changes how we deliver services in practice. But she did a lot of work in thinking about how we define value and when this value conflicts. So I would like to use her background work for her DPhil thesis to design an arc for our conversation rather than going framework after framework, and there is a risk of death by PowerPoint, hearing stories. So I wanted to structure these stories around some thematics. So I'll stop here And I will ask Mathilde to take the microphone and tell us some useful hooks on which we can hang our conversation. So Mathilde, over to you to introduce some theoretical ideas to help our thinking.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Mara. So as you have said, the session focuses on how to assess public value. And I will focus on the methods and also challenges that we go through when we try to measure public value. So the questions that I would like to try to answer to are how to collectively define public value, how to concretely implement value assessments in measurement devices, and then how to integrate assessment outcomes into decision-making. So I propose a theoretical framework to address these questions based on my PhD research. So as Mara said, I'm a PhD candidate in science and technology studies based at FAIR, the French National Advisory Board on Impact Investments, which has been developing social impact bonds in France for several years now, and also in collaboration with the Center for the Sociology of Innovation in Paris. And I have studied for 4 years now the implementation of social impact bonds, that is, projects in which governments pay for outcomes. And one of my dissertation chapters is about the evaluation of outcomes in social impact bonds, and more precisely, the process of valuing outcomes, also what I call the process of valuation of outcomes. And I have thus analyzed the process and negotiations for defining metrics to evaluate social outcomes, also for calculating economic benefits for the states, for collecting data, and in the end, displaying actual results. So based on this study, I propose to address the issues of assessing and measuring public value through 3 lines of analysis. The first one is what you can see now on the screen, the coexistence of multiple regimes of value and the subsequent conflicts and compromises between different stakeholders. The second will be the operationalization of value assessments into measurement devices through calculative tools and graphic representation. And the third one will be about using value assessments in decision-making. So we can go back to the first slide, please, about the coexistence of multiple regimes of value and the subsequent conflicts and compromises. Right. Thank you. So let us first think about what public value covers. So first, it is constituted of distinct values, namely economic, financial, social, environmental, cultural, moral values all together. And these values can conflict. For instance, is financial value always moral? Should economic value be prioritized over environmental value, for example? Second, public value is defined and shared by several stakeholders, the state, citizens, and also taxpayers, beneficiaries and providers of public services. So there is the question of who defines public value and who should then benefit from public value. And all the stakeholders do not necessarily participate in value definition, or they may disagree with the existing definitions. Indeed, and it is my third point in the chart, the stakeholders may have competing interests. For instance, taxpayers might want to reduce taxes, whereas social providers would need to increase public support. And fourth, different actors apprehend public value through different assessment tools, such as KPIs, financial ratios, statistics, qualitative assessments, through interviews, for example. So we have really different ways of concretely measuring public values between different stakeholders. Then, how to analyze the constitution of one public value? The notion of multiple regimes of value put forward by Boltanski and Thévenot and also Boltanski and Capello is useful to analyze disputes and compromises in the measurement of public value. In this perspective, actually, when a state of affair has to be settled, practitioners face practical tests that are called trials. And trials require gauging several frames, standards, or general principles, which are called orders of worth, to determine what is right and what is wrong, what is valuable and what is not. So in this view, different orders of worth are systematically intertwined in value frameworks. As for example, Capello and Knoll have argued about social impact bonds. They have argued that moral, political, and technical financial dimensions are actually intertwined in SIB's value frameworks. So the second part would be about the operationalization of value assessment into measurement devices. Implementing value measurements into concrete accounting systems may pose technical, cultural, and sometimes legal challenges. Value assessments require material valuation infrastructures, which includes calculative devices, databases, software, dashboard, etc. And on the one hand, assessment systems integrate the different regimes of value that coexist. But on the other hand, assessment systems promote certain values. For instance, Emily Barman has shown that the valuation infrastructure of impact investments keeps financial value and social and environmental value separate by using two different value assessment systems. And she has also argued that social and environmental value is framed depending on specific metrics, such as the gene standard indicators that you might know. And the third part is about how are value assessments turned into actionable information? Do value assessments prescribe or orient effectively decision-making processes? So this would be the third pillar of this presentation, which deals with the integration of value measurements into decision-making processes. Value assessments can indeed inform decision-making, but they can also legitimize decision-making. As I show in my dissertation in the case of social impact bonds, I show that assessments of economic benefits, for instance, for the states, become and aim to be an actual justification for public entities to fund SIBs, often regardless of the scientific robustness of the calculations, actually. But however, one should keep in mind that value data, for example, prices, social outcomes, or cost data, is not neutral. It comes from the valuation processes that I have previously described. So it promotes a certain view on public values, which I argue is not good or bad. It's just an important thing to be aware of for decision makers, especially. And to finish with, value assessments can also provoke what they aim to measure, as we will discuss later in the session. And this phenomenon is also known as performativity, and it means that the reality will always tend to stick to the objectives that are set, for instance, in terms of KPIs. So thank you. This is the value framework that we will be using in the rest of the session, and I hope it's clear, but if you have any question, we can discuss it afterwards.
Thank you so much, Mathilde, and we look forward to read your full dissertation in due course. So as Mathilde said, this is how we're structuring the discussion. So I'm now opening a conversation. We selected some of the speakers that can really speak on how the framework they are familiar with, the framework they've been engaging with, manage these multiple regimes of value. How do they do these trade-offs? How do they define values? The value doesn't exist in the air, you just don't take it. You need to choose how you define this value, who defines this value, and the conflicts and compromise that you have to make to say, this is how we define value. So we are focusing on this process in the first part, and we'll stop for some Q&A, but feel free to flow the questions in the chat. We then move to a second session where we are looking at the operationalization. So if this is how we define value, how do we measure it in practice? And finally, we'll do a third part that we reflect like, this is how we define it, this is how we measure it in practice, but so what? What do we do with it once we measure it? In what way does it change our decisions? So this is what we are doing today, and we'll stop for Q&A at the end of each part. So for the first part, this coexistence of multiple regimes of value and the compromise that we make, I am taking you on a journey across 4 countries' experiences. And I will go first to Mika, who is joining us in person here from Finland. And in Finland, there is a lot, he's been working with colleagues in academia on defining social quality. It's intriguing. What do we mean by social quality? And is combining research with and evidence with national databases to make it really concrete. So, Mika, you are combining economic value and social value. As Mathilde say, sometimes there is a conflict there. Are they compatible? And so, how do you monetize social quality? What is it?
Yeah. So good morning, everybody. My name is Mikko Vuoren. I'm coming from Sospet Center, or Sospet Keskus, as we tend to say in Finland. And so we basically build evaluation matrices to assess social value, both for NGOs, for governments, and for private sector. And this story goes to year 2021, when Central Finland Healthcare District had a need to enhance preventive substance abuse work through knowledge management. What they did was that they started to look at the national health indicators based on social quality framework. Tommy will be discussing about this social quality framework later, but their interest was to show that, in fact, substance abuse is something that is causing costs to all the sectors of the society. So that is why they turned to us and asked that how can we show, with the help of social quality indicators, that in fact this phenomena is causing costs to different sectors. So what we started with was their need to create an evaluation tool that could help different sized of municipalities, even the tinier ones with 5,000 residents to the bigger ones with 100,000 or 500,000. So the first step was to combine the, as it says in the step 1, the specific indicators coefficient with the number of the age group in one area. So that is how we can create these regional target groups. That's kind of the baseline for all the work that we did. After this, we start to think that, okay, now that we know that, for example, how many youngsters between 12 to 16 years old are moving once per week, then now we want to know how is this influencing the target group, their closed ones, and the wider community. This brings us to step 2, when we start to split these health indicators into block effects. And in the third phase, the idea is to find reliable estimations of the generality of each block effect. As an example, if we think of the youngsters who are moving once every week, that's also causing costs for the society in terms of, for example, accidents. So we need to assess that how often youngsters go to a health clinic or health center due to a broken ankle, for example. And after we've kind of combined the block effects, the values, we need to also assess that to which sector of society this specific coefficient, this specific clock effect is causing costs. And then we verify the results. As Mathilde said, now we come into the kind of risky part where we come in with our own values, with our own thinking. And different parties have great interest to the values that we are creating. If it's the private sector or a county or a municipality, all of them have different interests. So that is why we, of course, principle of prudence, double accounting, we check those. But in the phase 4 and 5, what we do is that we first create the values as a neutral actor, then we give them to a neutral steering group that check the values that we've created, and then we give the values and the evaluation framework forward to the municipalities themselves. They can tailor the values, they can change all the coefficients if needed to, for example, if the prices are changing, if there's new phenomena in these tiny municipalities that they need to take into account. But as an end result, we have evaluation tools that municipalities and welfare counties can use for free to assess that which costs different phenomena are causing to our municipality or to our welfare county. And we got a extremely encouraging feedback from National Institute of Health, from Ministry of Economics, for example. And with the support of that, we managed to get a now 2 years grant, with which we are also involving this time range of 5 and 10 years. And also we are involving the social investment aspect in these matrices. But in the end of 2023 or in the beginning of 2024, we are able to pass forward the next version to Finnish municipalities and welfare counties to support their decision-making in these matters.
Thank you so much, Mika. I find it really interesting to see how you start with the population of interest, the ring around them as a starting point, but then you act as a broker, bringing in an external steering committee, because it's always difficult to bring monetary value, especially on a vulnerable population, like the one we are working with. Thank you so much. I'll take you now on a flight to Japan. We have Reggie, who is joining us online. Reggie is based at the Ministry of Justice, but his work has been looking at the welfare of the workforce in the criminal justice service and how we can improve the well-being of the workforce. Can we call you in, Reggie? Welcome.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can hear you very well.
Yes, and thank you for introduction, Mara. Good morning from Tokyo. My name is Reiji Ikeda. I am the Offender Rehabilitation Support Manager, Chief Probation Officer in the Tokyo Probation Office, Ministry of Justice of Japan. Currently, I am responsible for employment and housing support for prison leavers, and as well engaged with data-driven management to implement robust support programs in the community settings. And I was based in federal practice at Blavatnik School of Government. By the end of March, in this panel, I will share my insights and learning from GoLab visit. Special attention will be paid to well-being perspective in value measurement with my practical experience. First, I would like to give a short overview of probation practice. As the table on the slide shows, our supervisors have complex risks and needs. For example, elderly supervisor A have housing and alcohol problems, and drug supervisor B have family conflicts. They will not be able to get their ID easily. Most importantly, our supervisors are involuntary clients. Indeed, there are many people with low motivation for rehabilitation. That is why the concept of legitimacy is important in our practice. Therefore, probation officers create and enhance relationships to motivate prison leavers into social integration. As some criminological reports have shown that relationships quality has a positive impact on rehabilitation in the long term. On the other hand, our works are emotional labors. Probation supervisor will work persistently. Probation supervisors will work persistently with client to increase the level of engagement and compliance. That is why front officers have organization philosophy that values patience and persistence. Next, I would like to mention the importance of occupational well-being in defining public value from my practical view. I think that this well-being variable could be a significant confounding variable in outcome measurement. Occupational well-being is a complex psychological concept. It means a healthy work-life balance, meaningful work, and a good fit in the job. Outcome indicator for offender rehabilitation usually use 1 or 2 year reoffending rate after release from prison. However, occupational well-being impacts the quality of relationship with the supervisors. Staff sickness and turnover will also affect seriously service delivery mechanism. In short, reduced staff well-being undermines taxpayers' benefit. In the long term, I am implementing a data-driven strategy to facilitate the employment of offenders, but I'm looking for the way that fits into our organizational climate. As for measurement well-being, generally well-being can be measured quantitatively using the psychological method, but the assessment method may be different from practical area. In our field, working hours could be used as one of indicator, but in my opinion, semi-structured interviews with frontline officer should be done in the context of process evaluation. Importantly, the evaluation is help continuous improvement, that is kaizen in Japanese. So I'm planning to monitor the impact of employment support for offenders with a GoLab shipper toolkit. In my opinion, this toolkit will be a useful framework for practitioners. My challenge is to include an assessment of the well-being impact in this toolkit. In other words, I would like to include a sustainability perspective in this toolkit. So I will continue collaborating with GoLab in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Reggie. This is a big challenge to put these aspects and try to measure them to change how you do your work. Good luck in really influencing how you manage the workforce in the ministry. So we covered some measure of well-beings, and I'm taking you to New South Wales in Australia with Nandita, who traveled all the way to be here with us for the conference. Nandita worked in the Planning Environment Department, and she's an expert in land use. So it's a different environment, but the New South Wales government has developed a quite extensive public value framework. And they're touching on any type of value, really. Like if you look at their framework, and Nandita will tell us more, is the economic aspect, social aspect, and environmental, the cultural aspects. But it's very dynamic. It's a lot of aspects. They change over time and over space. So how do you measure and reconcile these conflicting values? Going back to Mathilde's, saying that there are multiple values and they don't often go in the same direction. What is your experience? It should be on the microphone.
Thanks, Mara. And in order to address your question, I will first give a short context about the New South Wales Crown Lands. And by the way, I'm Nandita Das. I work for the Department of Planning and Environment in the New South Wales Government in Australia. So Crown Lands is a division within the Department of Planning and Environment in New South Wales Government. Crown Land Estate is held in trust by the New South Wales Crown lands on the behalf of the community. There is around 34 million hectares of Crown land estate in New South Wales, which makes up approximately 42% of the state, an area which is larger than United Kingdom. The Crown land estate is comprised of vast variety of land types, assets, infrastructure, enabling a diverse range of uses from recreation, agriculture, cultural and heritage sites, and environmental conservation. Majority of Crown land is in regional and remote areas of New South Wales. 12.4 billion, that's what Crown land was valued as per the last financial statement. But more than the financial value, Crown land is highly valued because of the social, environmental, cultural outcomes that are created, delivered, and enjoyed by the diverse communities and businesses on it across the state. In 2021, the New South Wales government released a 10-year strategic plan for Crown lands, which specifies the development and implementation of a public value framework. The public value framework is a flagship project of New South Wales Crown lands. Public value on Crown land is co-created by all actors. The management of Crown land takes place through a devolved arrangement where local councils manage more than 34,000 Crown land reserves, along with volunteers, Crown land managers, community members, civil society organization, and private businesses. Public value is dynamic as it changes with different land use, the quality of assets on land, location of the land, and temporal context. The definition and different interpretations of public value also differs between different stakeholders and users group, and is often contested because of competing interest. Where there are competing claims, New South Wales Crown land aim to resolve them in a way that is fair, equitable, and aligned with the government priorities, but more with the community priorities. This supports the commitment of managing the land for the greatest benefit to the community of New South Wales. Embedding public value framework as a decision-making process, as a measurement and evaluation framework is a cultural shift, a transformative and a long-term undertaking for New South Wales Crown lands. To measure and reconcile competing values on Crown land, it is important to first and foremost unpack what is public value. A series of public value mapping workshops were conducted with New South Wales Crown land staff, executives, and senior leadership from different divisions of New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment. As part of these workshops, some of the agreed principles, objectives of public value that were stated were, we are always on country. And this is an acknowledgement to Crown lands estate's existential relationship with the Indigenous people. We focus on delivering value, building trust and transparency, a deliberative engagement process to understand what the broader public actually values using local knowledge and priorities, and an investment logic tool to move beyond economic valuation of highest and best use to New South Wales Treasury for funding. The overall assessment of public value framework is therefore to balance three perspectives, which are legitimacy and support, public value outcomes, and operational capacity, to ensure that the options recommended are financially responsible, facilitate the delivery of strategic government priorities, and maximize public value. Through a series of consultations with the Crown land staff, a detailed mapping of public value outcomes was developed, as you can see from the slide. A public value mapping scorecard will be adopted to assess different outcomes scenario for different land uses focused based on the scope of community that is impacted. For example, 3 hypothetical future uses are presented here. A school, an open space, a mixed use, which is housing and open space. And the radius graphs that you can see is intend to visually communicate the public value benefits and disbenefits for each option. This is just an example from another state in Australia, but it will be adopted for in the New South Wales context. The role of cost-benefit analysis for Crown land was assessed as part of the measurement and evaluation of value on Crown land. Due to the data limitations, variety and extent of Crown land estate makes CBA assessment challenging and not feasible. CBA uses static measures, which is limited to capture the dynamic nature of public value on Crown land estate. Direct measures are used as a baseline, and the emphasis on consumer benefit and consumer surplus fails to capture the role of all citizens in the co-creation of public value. Current work has only factored the historical or the present value of land. This is problematic as public value continues to accrue many years after the usage of land is changed or improved. Given what we want to look at the entire value of the estate, the spillover effects is likely to be overestimated given the limitations of measuring spillover. This would therefore undermine the legitimacy and robustness of the framework. So the dynamic nature of public value requires dynamic evaluation and measurement metrics. It requires dynamic processes to widen organizations' understanding of value creation. It must also build its capacity for iterative learning, data analytics, and experimentation. Currently, we are exploring the role of different measures in capturing the dynamic nature of public value on land, such as the importance of land usage, land quality, and visitation information. A pilot project was undertaken on evaluation of selected Crown land sites that could be optimized for green spaces and recreational activities. And as part of this evaluation and measurement, the key evaluation measurement metrics included direct, indirect, and spillover measures such as community well-being and livability index, belonging, social cohesion and diversity, local economic growth and resilience. It captured both financial and non-financial metrics, quantitative and qualitative data through spatial mapping, land assessment tool, public value scorecard, and foremost, the direct engagement with the community. Reconciling values on Crown land is often challenging because it really varies from site to site and is dependent on the community context, what is being proposed with it, who else has legal interests on it, and what is community's viewpoint on it. However, what I do believe is that the process of deliberative engagement is not always to reconcile competing interests, but instead to encourage citizens to seek the public interest or public value. An example of such engagement of Crown land is a historic agreement between New South Wales government and Karua Local Indigenous Land Council, which secured Dungog's Reserve, which is in Upper Hunter, which was lodged as an Indigenous land claim future as a mountain biking destination. The deliberative engagement process was undertaken between the New South Wales government, the local Indigenous land councils, and the Dungog community. And it was decided that the best outcome is to have a world-class mountain biking destination. The community therefore secured $600,000 from the New South Wales government to transform Dungog into a tourist hotspot. The investment will also protect Aboriginal culture and heritage and provide additional funding to deliver mental health first aid workshops for the non-profit organizations. And through the process of this piece of work that I have been involved since inception, the development and as well as the implementation of public value framework, a key learning is that public value is a less of a destination than permanently ongoing process of creation and recreation. I will end here, and I hope that somewhat answers your questions, Mara. Thank you.
Thank you, Nandita. Very rich presentation. I trained as a decision analyst, and as you were talking, I was thinking one of the first things they teach you is like you need to distinguish fact from values. And facts you can measure, like you can have tools, but values you need to ask. Yes. And also Reggie before he was talking about, oh, we need to have interviews. So values come from deliberation, and there is no normal tool there. So I thought the resonance between the two presentations and the dynamism and the importance to go local is a perfect springboard to come to Diana. Diana joins us from the Northeast University in London. She's a researcher, and I'd like to ask her to talk us a little bit about her research on the use of data and sampling. But she's been looking really at financial metrics and financial proxy of social outcome. And so it would be good to hear what are your findings and your insights. She focused on the UK and the US. But then I would like you to reflect, linking back to Nandita, like those measures often are global, like the SDGs, the genes, and there are these global metrics, but often values need to be localized, and then they take meaning in a particular setting and context. How can this be balanced, and what are your reflections? So your research first, and then this difficult question.
Very difficult. Thank you, Mara. Good morning, everyone. This is ongoing research that I'm presenting here, and it's a grant-funded research. It was very strongly also supported by my research assistant, who is in the room, Phoebe Gerard, to give the full acknowledgement. We have also put together a paper which will kind of outline everything that we did, but our interest was spurred by selecting place-based value creation frameworks such as social return on investment to understand value creation and measurement at the organizational level, and then to see, as you say, Mara, whether there is any scope to make it more accessible and more scalable by integrating with other frameworks, and in our case that was the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Goals framework. We started off by acknowledging obviously the global goals, and in particular understanding or trying to understand and enhance the value of contextual target indicators, and then looked at more recent research which advocated for the integration of social return on investment in the SDGs, which were some were theoretical papers and some were practice papers, and to see whether we can build on that. We realized quite early on that the challenge, or one of the many challenges around this, was data assurance, data validity, and we decided that even though there is a lot to do around social return on investment, we're actually going to focus on the data side of things and whether we can indeed assign a value to social outcomes. So we developed a methodological procedure to try and address some of the methodological and empirical gaps in this regard. And our methodological procedure, as you can see on the screen, included topic modeling, and then sampling of national databases. We made that decision, which certainly affected our sufficient data, and that's probably for another discussion. We used the UK as our core model, and our first data bank, national data bank, was developed around the UK because we realized that the UK has a lot more by way of regulatory guidance around this than what we found in the United States, even though social return on investment was originally developed in the US, but then significantly advanced in the UK. We, however, established that one of our most kind of fertile database for potential US proxies for social value, the census, aligned quite closely to the topic modeling which we derive from the Treasury's Green Book in the UK context, and so that allowed us to be relatively satisfied with our topic modeling. What we did is then obviously sample the national data sets and discover, as we did, a number of sufficient data to assign as financial proxies. We cleaned the data, we made sure that our units of measurement and so on were all aligned, and then we discovered that we have very disparate data density. So we found a lot more data within our UK data sets than we did in the US. Around 7 times as much data in the UK context than in the US. Perhaps unsurprising, right? This is just affirmation that we have more regulatory sort of guidance and pressure in this regard in the UK than we do in the US. So then we thought, well, how can we actually optimize the available data, right? We want to see if social return can be scaled up, can be made more accessible, can reduce the cost, so that at the organizational level, there is greater incentive for enterprises of different size to actually engage with, to some degree with social value measurement, and for us to then gain a better perspective of how we're progressing on things like social justice, climate justice, ecological justice, right? Things that we want to have some idea around. So then we use the conduit of the Sustainable Development Goals to basically optimize our data. It allowed us to perform contextual translation of some of the kind of terminology between the US and the UK. It therefore allowed us to use better our topic modeling and assign many proxies or find more sufficient data for a financial proxy assignment to use within social return on investment. So we did something like a recodification, basically using the SDG target indicators in particular. And so that ultimately gave us grounds as part of our conclusions to say, okay, there is value in integrating place-based value frameworks with the global frameworks, with the global goals. It allows us to optimize available data. It allows us to overcome some of the barriers that exist naturally, right? Different countries have very different engagement with social value measurement. And at a minimum, obviously, a very different amount of data exists in this regard. And so what we were able to do, as you can see on the slide, is to say, okay, broadly speaking, through these approaches of contextual translation and recodification using the SDGs, we probably can expect to find enough sufficient data to cover a good range of the Sustainable Development Goals, right, when we try to measure progress in that regard. But on closer inspection, we still ended up with very different data density between the UK and the US. And in both the contexts, as you can see, we actually found no data for some of the goals, notably 14, 15, which is life below water and on land. And that obviously bodes very poorly for those interested in ecological justice in the main. So we basically ended up saying that, we're probably on the right path, looking for integration of place-based value creation and global frameworks. But a lot more needs to be done by way of contextual translation. We should be looking for other methods as well to help us optimize data. And I guess for policy people here, our overall message is that we actually need more data. Organizations certainly do, and aligns very well with a recent report that just came out a few days ago through the UN, I believe, that said that enterprises in the Western Hemisphere are doing rather poorly in terms of advancing towards the SDGs, but it's not necessarily for lack of trying or wanting to, just because they don't really have much by way of targets, much clarity on frameworks, and much by way of data. And our research in many ways kind of affirms that. So I'll pause it here and hopefully provide some answers.
Thank you, Diana. You definitely need to come to the session on Indigo and the use of data tomorrow around lunch. And John, there is a table outside for our data initiative. Please stop by. There is some lovely chocolate for those of you who are in Oxford. I'll pause here. Thank you so much for this was a quick tour of the world. I'll pause for maybe a couple of questions. I know, Yuko, you've been following the chat. If there is any question in the chat, if you can invite the person to post the question directly. And if there are questions in the room, just raise your hand. I would like to ask you, before you ask the question, who you are, where you're calling from, what your organization, so that we get to know you. So we have a question in the room, and you have something online? Not yet. Yes. Can you say your name and
Yes,
do we have a microphone? No, we do have a microphone in the room.
Loudly. Thank you for a very Thank you for a very interesting panel discussion. Is this on?
It should be on.
Okay. So I'm Jacob Weissen, and I'm from RISE, the Research Institute of Sweden, where we do a lot of meteorological stuff, which is very interesting to take part of your discussions. So I'm curious to know if we are talking about like building frameworks of valuation here. And I agree with how you can use a participatory approach to make sense of values and to describe the values in a qualitative way. But I'm also curious to know if you in the panel or anyone else have explored methods of analyzing how well the indicators fit the qualitative descriptions that we try to measure. And if you have used anything else than qualitative methods such as rash analysis, item probability analysis, and so on.
Thank you. Okay, we have Mika, who is attempting a first answer.
A fast response is that I think one way to analyze whether the frameworks are working is that are they being integrated as a part of decision making. 2018, when we were piloting our work in Pori, that is the 10th biggest city in Finland approximately, they took it, the municipality took it as a part of their decision-making processes. And for us, that was kind of feedback that, okay, we are slightly on a right track. And so, yeah, and I think surveys and the methods you mentioned, those are good, but still we are kind of trying to look at are the frameworks being integrated as a part of the existing decision-making processes? Are they being discussed, lifted up as examples, for example, in among politicians? Yeah.
Thank you, Mika.
Can I just add a comment?
On a microphone, please, so people online can all hear you properly.
And that's very interesting with sort of the usability and how well it's implemented. But in terms of validity, like how well those indicators measure the things we want to measure, it can open up a discussion also what we don't measure. We are measuring something, and I'm just curious to know if you had that discussion as well. That's just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. We are all working at you, Mika.
I'm pondering. I think, as I mentioned, we tried to do the testing in 3 phases. And the last phase is that we give it forward to the specialists in welfare coordinators in municipalities who have the chance to give criticism to us. And in Finland, we have the system where that each municipality are using these welfare stories where they plan the welfare of the area. And yeah, we are testing that, and the feedback is coming directly from the end users, just concerning the validity and are these working? Are the values working? Are the impact change working? Yeah.
Thank you, Mika.
Thank you. We have one question from online, and this is for Nandita regarding the New South Wales Public Value Framework. How are values of future generations taken into account in the public value assessment?
Thank you. That's a great question. I don't have an easy answer to that yet, because we are still in the development of building up a framework for measurement of intergenerational impacts. But at the moment, the conventional way to look at it is the discounting process through CBA analysis. And we do understand there are limitations. But as I said, that the Crown land, and especially with land use, it's a really very complex domain to look at something more standardized. I think when we are looking at the future generations, the impact on intergenerational values, we have to really look at side by side based basis. And I think that's the process that we are developing at the moment, is how to really capture each community context and each community, and also the indigenous people within that community and land use, is to really look at side-by-side basis. But I guess to answer to your question is that we are in that process, but at the moment we are really focused on using the discounting method through the CBA, but it is not really the ideal way we want to measure the intergenerational impact and values. Thanks.
Thank you, Nandita. Thank you, everybody, for your question. I'll move us on to our second part of the conversation. So as I said, we started by talking about how do we define value, what do we decide to measure, and we move on being more operational. Once you say, in principle, this is what I would like to measure, the detail of how do we operationalize such measure, and what are the technical challenges. And I am inviting people from the UK, Australia, and India to comment on this topic. And I will go first to very local, to Oxford. We have Stan Gilmore here from Thames Valley Police, who has been very ingenious with the use of data and building a platform. Often when we think about the police, we think, oh, this is about crime reduction. But actually, I invite everybody to go on your local police website and try to see what they are about. And it's much more than reducing crime. It's all about making the community feel safe, keeping it safe and resilient. And they have a much broader role. So you're here today because you develop a very interesting data hub that goes well beyond police data, because what you do is not just policing. Can you tell us about that experience, this infrastructure, and what are the benefits and the challenges that you encountered?
Sure. Well, Stan Gilmore, as has been said, I'm a 30-year police veteran, and I hosted a colleague from New South Wales Police a few weeks ago, so it's nice to see you in the room. I'm currently on secondment to the Thames Valley Violence Reduction Unit, which is a Home Office funded network, really, of organisations involved in who touch on serious violence within our communities, so broader than policing. In order to get some idea of the things that we should be focusing on, and you've heard a lot about it today, we needed to get good data on what the issues were. But we also needed to take a view on those data, and we heard about this at the top of the meeting, on how to value those different items that we were receiving in. Because there's a big difference between a broken ankle, as kind of Mika discussed earlier on, and a concussion. Now, you may, if you put a value on a broken ankle, it might cost quite a lot, because they'll probably go into an emergency department, they'll get some treatment, you may have to return 6 weeks later or even earlier for a follow-up. But if you get a concussion, you might not even go into a hospital. You might just feel bad for a while, recover and get on with it. But what's the social impact of a broken ankle compared to a concussion? Now, if I tell you that 80% of women in prison have a brain injury, which is what a concussion is, then that may be news to you. So is there a correlation then, a causal link between going into prison and a brain injury? Well, there's lots of research that would suggest there absolutely is, including some very fine research from Sweden. So the value then, the social value that you might attribute to a broken ankle compared to a concussion means very different things once you start looking at the risk factors and not just the events. And that's what we try to do through our data, which is to pull data in from a broad range of organizations. It does several different things. One thing that we haven't heard mentioned today, we've had values and morals and legitimacy mentioned, but I've not heard anyone mention ethics. And here I am in Oxford University, and my goodness, nobody's mentioned ethics. What's going on? At the heart of our work is very much an ethical framework on how we do this, how we pull data in, and then what we do with it. And to the point that you made earlier about how do you value things, it's not the misuse of data that's my kind of problem. We can deal with that. It's the misuse of data that's the issue. It's the things that aren't measured, the things that aren't recognized to be important. And I mentioned brain injury to women, as a kind of clear example of some of those issues, because the male gaze permeates much of our data and our data systems and our structures. And that male gaze often makes women invisible in our data, because women are seen as a facet of their relationship to the men. And certainly in crime data, women are shown as victims or girlfriends or associates or present or not. They're not really taken into account as whole human individual people. And therefore we have a lot of missed data on women and their role and their roles. So there's a lot that we need to do in order to fill in the gaps in data, make sure that we don't miss receiving data that we might put to good use. So in order to do that, you have to have an approach, a governance that does a couple of different things. One, you need good governance to ensure that you have a defensive data strategy, because those data that you're receiving are valuable, they're personal, and they need to be kept secure. They need to be kept in a secure and accredited environment, and one that you can then use the data from. So we've created a cloud-based, secure, accredited environment for our data to be loaded into from the different organizations that are shown on the slide here. So we have a defensive data strategy with gateways for sharing information, with methods to make sure it's kept safe. But you then need, when you speak to many organizations and ask them for their data strategy, they'll talk about data protection. At least the lawyers will. And it's really difficult because we mentioned earlier on, everyone said it, you need good data, you need good data sharing in order to understand what the social outcomes are from what you're delivering. And it's not just the social outcomes for those people who are vulnerable, and we can talk about that in a second. It's the outcomes for everyone, because everyone wants to have a share of the outcome. So you need good data on everyone, one for benchmarking, but two for baselining outcomes. So in order to get those data, you need to get through the data protection, the data security side, but you then need to mobilize those data. And you need to have an offensive data strategy that then says, what are you going to do with those data? How are you going to use those data to make decisions on where you're going to put resources or where you're not going to put resources, so to your point. And those decisions are ethical decisions. And that's why I'm surprised that nobody's mentioned ethics, because in order to put resources in one place and not another, you've got a couple of decisions there. What effect will it have for good? What effect will it have for bad? And where you've not put the resources, similar questions. So big ethical decisions on doing something and not doing something. And not everything you do is going to be perfect. And not everything you do is not going to cause harm. You know, in health, there's a term, iatrogenic treatment, isn't it? Where, you know, if you break your ankle and it goes septic, you might need to have your bottom part of your leg amputated. Well, that's harmful. You cut a bit of your body off, but you know, they've saved your life. So there's an iatrogenic kind of relationship there. And it's the same with policing. It's the same with housing. It's the same with education. Sometimes things that happen to people are not don't always look great on the face of it, but they are for the greater good for them and for society. So an ethical problem. So we created a technology to be able to host these data and use them. But we also have to create a relationship with people that are sharing data. And that's the biggest part of the problem. You'd think that creating a cloud-based modern architecture with all the kind of whizzes and bangs that it contains would be difficult enough. But it's much more difficult having a conversation with somebody to say, can I have your data, please? Because in a room like this, if you were all, you know, data sharing partners, I'd say, you know, who's read the latest safeguarding report on the death of child P, where it says, because they all say it, that we need to get better at sharing data. And everyone would say, yes, I've read that. Yes, we do need to get better at sharing data. Do you think we should share data? Yes, we do. Can I have your data? No, you can't. So the cultural and not the technical stuff, as difficult as it is, nothing like the cultural stuff around sharing data. So there's a large part of the conversation is about, so what's the give back? What's the social outcome of you providing me with your data? Because there needs to be a payback. It's your data. You don't give it away. You get something back for it. I won't say what I was going to say. I was going to mention Apple, but there's a lot of Apple users out here. So, there needs to be a social outcome that is well described in what the benefit is of you giving me your data. Because many of the blockages for sharing data are from those people who don't benefit or don't perceive that they benefit from sharing data. The people that are most vulnerable, and let's mention that right now, vulnerability, in my view, is caused by the inability of people to access the resources they need to keep themselves or their families safe. So there's nothing inherently vulnerable about anyone, in our view. They are made vulnerable by their inability to access the resources they need to keep them and their families safe. So it's a systemic issue. And it's a systemic issue that brings us to the point on what is the social outcome from your actions, whether it's in the public or the private sector. Because the social outcome should be that you reduce vulnerability, and you do that by improving inclusion. And I mentioned brain injury because it's a really highly impactful element of our work. You're 5 times more likely to have a brain injury under 5 years of age if you're in the poorest 5% of the population. And we know what impact a brain injury has, a lifelong impact a brain injury has on your ability to thrive and the likelihood that you will come into contact with justice services. So we know that there are really important reasons why we need to identify not just the events, but the risks that come from it, and take a risk and protective perspective on your data, but have your data available, not just at a population level, but at an individual level. Because it's at the end of the day, it's the individuals that need to benefit, and social outcomes need to benefit individuals. We need to be able to describe how individuals benefit from it, not just how they might benefit from it, should they be able to access the services. We need to get down to the individual level. So that's what we've done. There's a couple of quotes on there about one project that we've been involved in, which is a novel use of data, first ever opportunity to use that kind of data in the country. That's been created on the back of our processes. So thanks very much.
Thank you for bringing us back to the ethical dimension. When we talk about values, there is always an ethical framework. Good shout. And I think it will be a few people asking you, how do you broker this conversation on can you have your data? We've been there.
I'm only 21.
we are there too sometimes, even when we are not asking for sensitive information, but there is lack of clarity on what type of data you're allowed to share. Like, do you own it? Are you entitled to share? So there is sometimes maybe there is a willingness, but there is hesitation of like, will I get in trouble? Because it's not just my data. So very important conversation to have. Thank you. I'll come back to you in a few minutes to move on, how that does your framework impact decision making. But I want to go back to the experience of our colleague in New South Wales, and we have Sweta online, I think, who is based at the Treasury in New South Wales, Australia. And I would like Sweta to come in with a practical view on the operationalization of the framework on how they do outcome budgeting and the challenges that she has faced, in particular, in holding people to account. When you measure to hold some people in account. So how do you bring this accountability in the public sphere, like in public budgeting?
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. So my name is Shweta, and I'm calling in from Sydney, and I work at New South Wales Treasury. However, here in this presentation, all views will be my own, and they're built from my experience of facilitating public financial management reforms here in Australia and elsewhere across different jurisdictions. So really, in terms of trying to bring a practical experience to the audience, I'm going to be talking about how, there are different types of valuation architectures, but what I'm referring to is the classification of budgets into programs and outcomes, and, integrating reporting to sort of have financial and non-financial performance metrics using sector-specific data. And this is a move that we've seen across many jurisdictions, and some jurisdictions cover the whole budget, and then there are others which have variations such as covering just program expenses and talking about the value that is being brought through the delivery of those programs. And sometimes architectures are often used to report on aggregate budget performance versus those that can be disaggregated down to every dollar. So, for example, in New South Wales, my experience of working on outcome budgeting has looked at disaggregation of the whole of state budget right down to every public dollar used to drive public value. From the point of view of reporting to be effective, such an architecture or data structure used by the government, it needs to be co-designed and owned by departments. And there's a lot of different learnings that are coming through in performance-informed budgeting, and I can bring you some of them in terms of my experience of having worked in this area. And usually, I think the first thing to note is that departments, not treasuries, but line departments, may own and manage their own data structures. They really need to have robust program logics and the use of sector-specific measures that align with interjurisdictional best practice, as well as national reporting. Different departments are certainly at different levels of maturity in terms of the use of measures, as well as the quality of the data that they're using, as well as in terms of target setting. And target setting itself is an area that's challenging and has many concerns related to it, such as targets encouraging perverse incentives sometimes, or target setting being problematic in many other ways. But over time, departments are now starting to align their systems and capabilities to actually have better structures, better targets, to produce better data and embed a performance culture. So in terms of using this information from such data structures for decision-making, from the point of New South Wales, I think we've moved to the point where we are certainly using CBA's cost effectiveness analysis, multi-criteria analysis, reference class data from program evaluations, post-implementation reviews that can help assess the economic, social, environmental, and distributional impacts of investments, despite all the limitations with some of these methodologies. Now, in terms of evidence-informed policy development and budget decision-making, here I'm specifically referring to the process of embedding the use of this evidence and all the insights from valuation architectures into the policy development and the broader investment cycle, as well as government decision-making. This includes, from the point of view of agenda setting, which is looking at the strategic context, the economic and fiscal outlook, and setting the budget strategy. Then, moving on to policy or budget prioritization, policy formulation after proposals are assessed, and of course, the whole idea of putting proposals to Treasury and the resource allocation piece, the implementation of policies by departments, as well as the monitoring and evaluation of those policies. So when I refer to evidence-informed policy development, I'm actually referring to how the valuation architecture can be used across all of these processes. In doing so, I think there's a business maturity model and a cultural shift that's required. And from my experience of implementing performance budgeting and engaging with other jurisdictions, I've found that different governments are at different levels of the maturity curve in terms of operationalizing these valuation structures and translating that insight into robust budgetary advice. Some of the indicators for achieving such organizational maturity, for example, could be, is senior leadership committed to driving and fully supporting the outcomes and targets outlined in those valuation architectures that map out the budgets? Are the strategic planning, strategic budgeting, and performance management functions within government departments a joint collaborative effort? Which means, in other words, are the strategy teams, the divisions, and corporate services working together to actually streamline the architecture for decision-making? Is there strong governance to embed accountability and promote evidence-informed decision-making and prioritization? Could be in the form of a portfolio advisory committee or a portfolio delivery committee, but there has to be some structure which is robust, which sort of informs robust governance and decision-making. Then the other areas could be, is the organization investing in aligning the skills, capabilities and systems across the organization to support this change. Because a lot of times we see that while the leaders are talking about outcomes and targets, the systems, the skills and capabilities across organizations don't align, and that can be a huge challenge. So I think in terms of driving change, leaders need to walk the talk. They need to sort of, create conviction for outcomes across the org chart, but also support people to understand what their roles and responsibilities are in driving value from taxpayers' dollars through better implementation of programs. And they also need to have the right kind of systems to support this shift. The other indicator is, have our policies, standards, processes been updated to reflect, the whole shift towards outcome-based planning and budgeting? Is there a consistent and scalable communication strategy where you can engage not just the entire organization, but all your stakeholders to have a clear line of sight between the work that we're all doing and the outcomes we want to achieve? And then, of course, our ex-ante appraisals of new spending programs, are they being used to strengthen further program design and to facilitate new investment prioritization and processes of monitoring and ex-post evaluation? All of these things, I think, make a substantive difference to whether really robust valuation methodologies can actually be brought into decision-making within government. And I think that's all I'd like to say here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shweta. This is very rich, bringing back the human aspect of when you operationalize a framework. It's not just a technical framework and a list of indicators. You need to have the system in place and the people that know how to make it happen and in a meaningful way, really. So thank you so much, Shweta. I see there is a flurry of questions in the chat. I would like to bring in our colleagues from India, Akhilesh and Vieta. I saw Vieta on Zoom. Who also have been involved in an ambitious public value measurement framework, the output outcome monitoring framework in India that has about 5,000 indicators. So it's a massive exercise. Vieta, welcome. And we would like to hear your experience on this enormous framework, really, because it's a big framework, and how it works in practice, how it was operationalized, and how does it speak to the values, the public values that we aim to see reflected there.
Sure. Thank you so much. So to give a brief context on how it evolved, so initially we were first kind of measuring against the financial utilization or only the financial progress against any schemes or program policies. Eventually, the shift started from 2017 onwards when we started measuring outcome-based monitoring across every rupee that was being spent for service delivery. So in order to understand how do we operationalize these values in measuring the effectiveness of policies or any scheme implementation, the first step is to have a mechanism in place that measures this value or measures these performance of the scheme. And one of the first steps that we do, which is done on an annual basis, as well as whenever a new scheme is launched, is to define the measurable outcomes, indicators, and set a measurable targets against which the progress can be measured. And ideally, defining of these outcome indicators should be done at the scheme design and planning stage, which will help incorporate these data capturing mechanism during its implementation stage itself. Because if we design an indicator for a scheme that is already running retrospectively, then there are challenges regarding capacity constraints as well as data limitations in terms of lack of availability of data. And hence, defining the measurable indicators is one of the first steps that we focus on. And every year, we work with 67 ministries and departments to set and review the quality of these indicators for 500 plus schemes, which has both output and outcome indicators. And as you can see on this ladder, the first two functions falls under the monitoring functions based on the indicators that have been set and the target values that have been set. we monitor those schemes against these targets, against these indicators, and the next step is to identify these performing and non-performing schemes through appraisals and evaluations methodology. And during the monitoring aspect, it is mostly led by the planning or the line department or the scheme division officials, whereas appraisals are mostly a function of the planning as well as Ministry of Finance department. And once these schemes have been grouped under, categorized under performing and non-performing scheme, the next step is to take a decision based on these evidence that has been collected throughout the year, over a year and over the scheme life cycle itself, whether that scheme should continue or should we close down or should we rationalize certain schemes by merging multiple schemes with similar outcomes, given that this is such a massive number of indicators that we deal with. We should make it more leaner, and to make this, we can merge certain schemes or rationalize certain schemes which have similar outcomes and are and based on budgetary allocations as well. That would lead us to the last step, which is creating a robust portfolio of schemes. Not having too many schemes, but having schemes which are of indicators which are of critical indicators that helps measure those scheme performance. And the review and design step is where we incorporate the learnings from the data that we have gathered so far. What is working, what is not working, based on the output and outcome indicators. This will directly link back to the activities that are being done at the ministry level or at the scheme division level. And some of the operational lessons that we have learned so far is, like Shweta has also mentioned previously in her presentation, is one is the building that capacity across all levels of governance, from scheme division officials to the finance department to the planning department as well. And building capacity on both measures. One is to design these indicators, that designing a system, and to use this data that is being captured, that is to design and analyze. So capacity across these two levels is important. Second is the need for supporting pillars in terms of data maturity, because all ministries are at different levels of data maturity models and have different data architecture system. So incorporating these indicators at a design stage helps establish the data monitoring aspect across different ministries and departments. Second is third is facilitating regular review meetings with all stakeholders. So currently, we also undertake annual review meetings with the Ministry of Finance, Department of Expenditure, as well as the ministry line ministries, so that we discuss the problems being faced, challenges, operational challenges that we encounter in terms of data flow, data management, and also in quality of indicator setting, and how and if there are any best practices that can be shared across different ministries and departments. So these review meetings become critical in getting a perspective from other stakeholders on what is actually happening on ground, and when we define any kind of framework, how that framework is being actually implemented through different layers of governance. And fourth is simplifying the process, given there are so many schemes being monitored at a national level, and the indicators shouldn't lead to an information overload for the scheme division, for the implementers at the lowest level of governance. It shouldn't lead to too much of data and the information that is being captured. So simplifying this process is something we continuously aim or strive towards. So these are some of the 4 operational lessons that we have come across so far since the beginning of this exercise. And I'll just hand it over to Akhilesh sir to kind of walk you through the methodology on how we work around the measuring the performance of the schemes as per the defined output and outcome indicators.
Okay. Akhilesh, can you give just a brief, it's very technical, this slide, and I can see faces in the room like, can you just give it a flavor? Because I'm keen to move on to Q&A. So if you can, in like an elevator pitch, tell us what this metric is trying to capture. I think that will give us a lot.
Thank you, Vijeta. Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, I will not go detail in the technical aspect of the methodology, but you know, once since 2015, when we gone away with 5-year planning and switch over to outcome budgeting, the outcome monitoring frameworks play a critical role in assessing, you know, public expenses across implementing agencies, which basically have different interventions for overall development of the country. Basically, the frameworks has been developed on the principle of result frameworks. Yes, logical frameworks in which we identify every critical activities, outcomes, and you know, for overall vision of achieving the aim and objective of these schemes. But the frameworks basically helps in assessing ministry level performance. Therefore, it was there was a requirement to have one frameworks, one index which could help us to assess the performance of ministry and different ministry and departments, and with overall performance, so that inter-ministerial competitiveness may be enhanced throughout all the executing ministry and departments. So the framework is a very simple one. This is only based on the percentage achievement of the indicators against predefined outputs. Sorry, predefined targets. And the which in the methodology which basically involve in weighted arithmetic average of all the output and outcome indicator of every schemes, and the weight being the type of targets and the compliance of achievements. So these are basically the explanation of the methodology in nutshell. And if you have many questions on the technical aspect, we can discuss.
Thank you so much, Akhilesh. Thank you for sharing the nitty-gritty, the technical details of what happens on the ground in these measures. And good luck with simplifying the structure. I hope you have good ideas on the panel and on the chat for people to reach out to inspired in your evaluation exercises. I would like to pause a few minutes to take some questions. I'll come to Yuko first because I saw a flurry of conversation on the chat. Is there any question you want to pick up in plenary?
Absolutely. Thank you so much all for the questions. Some of the theme that's coming through is the pain point of sharing data and using those data, quantifying outcomes. So I think these 3 questions are quite related. So I'm just going to address this to you, Stan, if that's okay. Graham Randalls from Triangle says that crime-related intervention can cut costs, but can also make a wider community feel safer. It's easier to value the cost saving than the benefits to the wider community, and you views on this. And related to this, does data sharing solve the problem of not being able to measure the wider community? Reiji also would like to hear your thoughts around how we can actually collaborate to share this data, especially when the organizational structure is quite vertical in some cultural contexts.
Okay. Well, first off, Reiji, if you want to invite me out to Japan, I'll gladly come out and show you how to do it. You're absolutely right. It needs an end-to-end solution, and that end-to-end solution needs to be one that is fit for purpose for your organization. So kind of vertical integration is probably the first place to start. If it doesn't work for you, it won't work for anyone else as well. If there's any kind of follow-ups to this, then please get in touch, and I'll be happy to comment on them outside this meeting as well. But yes, look for an end-to-end solution. We went for a cloud-based solution because not only does it give us the kind of benefits of accessibility, but also provides the power of analysis. Using the technologies available in the cloud. So I would say perhaps think about moving from an on-premise solution to a cloud-based one, or at least an Azure cloud one, and think about what using a modern architecture to do that, as modern as you can, so that it'll allow partners to integrate as well. On the cost measuring one, yeah, you're right, Graham. I take your point. Obviously, the opposite is always true, is also true. So a crime intervention can add cost. I gave an example in my presentation as one of how that might happen. So you may imprison a parent, and when you imprison a parent, social care might be standing there with a checkbook ready to write £1 million check for the care of the children that are left behind. So it really depends on how you're measuring, again, back to that point, how you're measuring kind of harm, how you're measuring value, and importantly, how you're doing it across systems, not just criminal justice. And you may make the community feel safer. You may also make them feel quite unsafe, because many communities, and we've seen a lot recently across the world, will indicate that they feel over-policed and underprotected. So you have to be very careful in understanding the impact of your activity, and there's good enforcement, there's bad enforcement, and there's a good enforcement in terms of what works, which then becomes bad enforcement when the what works agenda changes. So, but to your central point, it's much easier to put a cost on events that have happened than it is on the events that haven't happened, and that's why we need to have a view on social outcomes. That's why we need to have good data sharing. That's why we need to have frameworks and perspectives that allow us to put a value on things that have been prevented, and therefore the good outcomes that come from it. And the way you do that largely is to assess the bad things that generally happen, and then assess when they don't happen, and then have a way across systems of costing that. And I saw a comment around the 16.6 billion or whatever it is in the pie chart. That was an attempt by the Early Intervention Foundation, and I can send you a link to their report, to put a value on the cost of late intervention. So for public services largely. So if you can prevent those bad things from happening, then you don't have a bill of that magnitude at the end when you're treating people for poor health or social outcomes as a result of earlier adversity.
Yeah, something very small. I was very intrigued by the fact that your topic modeling is very similar to ours, and probably because it's based on the UK Treasury, right? But I just wanted to say that one thing we discovered is that by adding the layer of the global goal target indicators, you can hit more than one cost outcome, and actually your data becomes richer and more optimized in terms of view. So that's one thing we discovered by doing that additional layer of recodification effectively. Yeah,
absolutely. And you know, we kind of concentrate on kind of 3 levels of data. So the kind of fully anonymized, pseudonymized, and then personal level data. But alongside the anonymized data, we're looking to attribute those layers of information as well that are available from global or national or regional data sets, so that we've got some additional understanding. But the idea of getting denser data is that you unbias the data, so that you can see more of the missing values when you're looking at it against the kind of national frameworks. Yeah.
Any question from the room? Can you introduce yourself? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jeff Matsu. I'm from CIPFA, the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy.
Can we give him a microphone? So,
Okay,
we don't need one. Okay, there are microphones everywhere in the room.
Before I ask my question, I just wanted to let everyone know that if you want to carry on this conversation around public value, we co-host a peer learning group here at GoLab, meet quarterly to talk about these very issues around data, measurement, and policy design. So please join us. It's on the website. My question to the panel is twofold. One is, given the spatial diversities in how public value is defined, who monitors and provides data assurance during evaluation? And how can equity finance be drawn into and at scale to better support public funding? Because I think that's a big challenge that we often face. I mean, we talk a lot about value, and then public funding and taxpayers try to, support that. But how do we draw in private equity into that equation?
Maybe Matilda online as well might have a view on this one before we move to the third part of our session?
I can have a go. I'm not sure it'll go in the right direction, but let me try. So we asked that exact question with our research. So part of it was, can we enhance data validity, data assurance, and then how do we then translate it into a measurement model such that can be used in the private sector, and therefore we can see more investment and target setting and all this sort of stuff. So we thought that our approach to optimizing data was adding a layer of data assurance, data validity. I can share the paper that we wrote on this separately. The other thing that we have done, and it's I think a little controversial and quite experimental, but we have it to a beta testing. Yeah, that's exactly. I'm wondering if I really do want to tell people, but we basically gave a social return on investment as a calculator, go to a digital beta version. And I say this probably controversial, and I'm in for grilling, because probably people are going to say, well, what are you doing with your stakeholder analysis and all this if you digitize it? But anyways, we've basically tried to further then optimize this integration of local global frameworks to see if it can work. We have a few entities that have signed up just to give us a layer of, do we have any accuracy in this? Are we on the right track? But are they interested? Could it actually draw investment, etc.? So we don't have any concrete results to report, but this is something that we want to do as our kind of next step. So I don't know if this really helps, but it's what we are thinking.
Can I quickly touch on that as well, because it's obviously something we're doing. So in terms of data quality, that's a big issue for us, and then you're looking at how do you improve data quality, and in what ways do you do that? Through human learning, which has been mentioned, but other methods that you might want to use. There's some off the shelf, but there's also many more that you can capture. So improvements to data quality, a big ethical issue. If you've not got good data, then are you making it? Can you ethically make decisions on the back of it? So you need to be able to kind of score your data quality. How do you then link that into kind of private equity and the kind of the corporate market? I guess is through a concept that we've got around value transfer. So what is the value transfer that is being had there? What's the benefit to kind of private equity and the benefit, the social outcome benefit, if you will, and how do you measure both of those things? Because a private investor will want to have perhaps a moral value transfer, but also perhaps a financial one as well. So you have to be able to sit back and say, you need to be able to describe the value transfer that's going on here in different domains. But largely based on improvements all the time in data quality. Yeah. And I would agree, we use some random forest modeling in order to test our data quality against unseen data sets, etc., so that we can have a good measure of how accurate our profiling is. So.
And making it a little more accessible, if I can just take a few seconds. So we've created these 2 national data banks of financial proxies, or we've made efforts at least starting on that, so that we make it more accessible and therefore a little easier, let's say, for corporates in particular, who are often looking for a quick report and a fast solution, so that they don't have to then run necessarily bespoke analysis and so on.
That's the value transfer.
Yeah.
They don't have to do it again.
Right.
And the same for third sector organizations. They don't need to invest huge amounts of money in profiling the environment. You provide that to them so that they, again, kind of a value outcome. They don't need to spend money that they get from donors on kind of admin tasks. So
Maybe answer your question, right? And maybe do we have a link to your work in the chat? Can we ask your assistant to post to make sure that everybody has access and follow up? Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll move us on to our last part, which is we talk about values. How do we define them? What is the difficulty in making it operational from a technical and also a human process point of view? And now, how do they change decisions on the ground? How do they impact what we do, how we do it in practice? And I want to go to Finland first, to your colleague, Tommy, who provides the academic inputs in the work that you are in your collaboration. And we've heard different ways of measuring outcomes from various speakers from all over the world. And I would like to draw you in for some reflection on how these values help you or help an organization to define roles and responsibilities, because then it has to impact decision making. So how do you connect those dots? The floor is yours, Tommy.
Okay, I'm not seeing the slides, but hopefully my voicing here. Okay, now is the right slide. So happy to be here on online. I'm Tommy Mäkiopas and I work as a research director at the University Eastern Finland in House of Effectiveness. And I'm talking about the framework that Mika presented earlier already, but about the background and how this kind of framework helps to develop better governance of social quality. The model of the framework assumes as such that high social quality enhances well-being and community as well as the individual potential. And this framework is not something new, but has been developed already for over 20 years in Europe in different instances. But how we have been developing in this sense is how to provide and develop this model in the sense of well-being policy making. The key idea behind this model is not only to evaluate the outcomes as measured as a well-being, but also the key processes producing the well-being, as well as the capitals society should invest in supporting these key processes. The key processes fulfilling the 4 conditions of social quality are present in the center of the picture. But in short, the processes include the social security, how to provide goods and services, and productive participation for all individuals, how to empower people, provide them opportunities and capacities to influence decision making, how to provide different possibilities to social inclusion as to guarantee human and social rights, equity, and so on. And finally, the 4th condition is the how to promote social cohesion in the society. The social quality model directs attention how especially the society should invest to promote these conditions, and therefore to promote comprehensive well-being of all people in the society. In so way, it also includes this kind of quite systemic view of the society and how these different conditions, outcomes, processes and structures behind form the human well-being in quite many ways in dynamic interaction. And in this sense, it's very important how people themselves see social quality, how they perceive the society promotes social quality as part of their everyday lives. So in this sense, it's not also important to evaluate the outcomes, but also these processes as well as the structures behind everywhere. And when we are aiming to promote especially safe, inclusive, active and cohesive society. And in this sense, it's quite clear that we need a collaboration with these different institutes that can invest key capitals such as economic, political, cultural, and also civic society. And as discussed already earlier by the previous presenters, it's clear that we have to take also into account the values, but also standards of different societies. What kind of values they prioritize or use as part of decision making. And this model suggests that these values should be included as equity, social justice, freedom, and solidarity. And in the end, as discussed by one of the previous speakers, it's very important to take into account these ecological, social, and economical sustainable perspectives that are presented in the lower end of the framework. So thank you. I'm happy to answer more questions later on.
Thank you, Tommy. I'm keen to go to Mathilde, who has been patiently waiting online as well. And bring us back to one of your provocations, Stan, on the ethical dimension and the fact that when we measure something, we do something, or when we fail to measure something, there is an ethical aspect on non-measuring, there is an ethical aspect in measuring. And once we measure, we might end up changing the reality around us, or when we decide not to measure, we are changing because we have an impact. There is a knock-on effect on decisions. And I know you have been studying how the measurement has changed how organizations behave in social impact bond across France, Colombia, and Chile. And I would be really keen to hear what you learn from what the measurement has done on the ground.
Yeah, thank you, Mara. Just a few words again about what social impact bonds are, because I don't know how familiar you all are about this scheme. So it's outcome-based contracts in which governments pay for effective social outcomes, with private investors providing upfront funding for service delivery. And so the notion of public value is essential in SIBs, since SIBs aim to account for social value in terms of effective social outcomes, but also economic value for the state in terms of savings on the one hand and benefits on the other hand. So in SIBs, there are impact objectives that are set at the beginning of the program, and the results, according to these indicators, are monitored during the program. So indeed, I have studied how these complex arrangements are concretely set up in different contexts in France, Colombia, and Chile. And I have focused on SIB practitioners' tribulation, let's say, and how all the implementation challenges actually shape the SIB projects. And I have shown that practitioners recurrently refer to the problem of feasibility, for instance, through feasibility studies, to justify design choices. But this is not the main point of this part of the presentation. So the problem of prescribing the values that we intend to measure is also known as performativity. And it's the idea that indicators and objectives actually provoke the reality they aim to describe, but also, and therefore, they limit the reality to specific theories of change as promoted by these indicators. So I have perhaps two contributions to make to answer to the question. And first, actually, the definition of social and economic values is often very much based on bricolage. It often requires trade-offs in scientific rigor and on calculations, because valuation, as we have talked about, depends on data availability, for instance, cost data. How much would the state save if young people not in employment, education, and training could be maintained in a job, or if homeless people were out of the streets, or if offenders never reoffended, and how much additional public benefits would be created? It's very unlikely that these questions have straightforward answers with up-to-date, clear data. And moreover, valuation is often turned to the advantage of public funders or investors to convince them to engage in social impact bonds. And for instance, cost-saving calculations are useful to legitimize public investment in SIBs. And to do so, to convince public actors to commit to SIBs, the emphasis is often put on savings that directly impact the targeted outcome payer. And the models are created so that savings appear to be higher than SIB expenditures. So there is all this bricolage, which is really important to take into account and to keep in mind. And second, what I wanted to say that impact indicators can concretely influence the actual results by, for instance, putting pressure on social operators. And I show in my dissertation that SIB social operators can use sometimes ad hoc criteria in order to make sure that the actual program beneficiaries can achieve at best the target objectives. And these practices include that of, for instance, cherry picking, that is selecting the population that is most likely to achieve the results, and thus excluding populations with more complex needs. So maybe to mitigate this risk, I think it's important to be aware of how the process of valuing social and economic outcomes does shape the way we actually see values and the actual activities aimed to produce these values. And in social impact bonds, I also recommend to involve social operators in the definition of outcome objectives in order to make sure that they can smoothly hit the targets. And well, also keep in mind that not all beneficiaries will comply necessarily with the same theory of change, since human behavior is complex. So I think flexibility is also needed in evaluation frameworks at some point.
Thank you so much, Mathilde, and thank you for providing the framework of this conversation. You reminded me of the tyranny of the metric. Once you measure something that really drives where you go, and sometimes we forget that, and we have a lovely brochure with some lovely metrics, but we need to think like, what is the intended and unintended consequences of measuring what we're measuring and not measuring other stuff, because we will have an actual impact on how we behave and how we change what we do. So I'll pause here for question in the room and question online. Maybe we only have 10 minutes, so maybe I'll take 2 or 3, and then we'll take them in group. So I have 3 in the room. I'll go from this side to the bottom and here and there. 4 people in the room.
Thank you for this discussion. I'm Shaylin Poppett. I teach at the University of Birmingham, and I'm also a DPhil student here at the Department of Education. And I think what I've taken away from this discussion is the role of translation, whether it's towards monetization, whether it's to future value, whether it's global frameworks and localization. And I think every presentation had an element of translation that has to occur. And therefore, as scientific as we want to be as researchers, we're all ultimately interpretativists. And I wondered what the panel thought the problem for decision makers that occurs. They want definitive guidance, but actually we're all interpreters.
Big conversation that we carry over lunch. I had a question. I'll pick the 4 questions in the room first, and then I look for volunteers to answer each of the questions.
I'm Neelima. I work in data services, making data standards. So we've worked on Indigo. So there was something Mathilde said at the end about bricolage. So essentially that thread was also there when I think Shweta mentioned departments making their own data. So how hard is it, or what is the contemporary frustrations that people have about not having a top-down view of data? Because if everyone's making their own siloed data and metrics, who has the big picture?
Thank you.
In the front.
Hi, I'm Vishali Bed. I'm a procurement and social value practitioner. So my question is quite practitioners oriented, because the world is changing really fast. The social tensions are increasing. And of course, we are talking about defining public value, defining proxy values, and defining frameworks. As a practitioner, my challenge is how soon these things are updated, because we need to update it quicker than what is happening in the world right now. So it's just an open question.
Thanks. One last question there, and then I'll come to the panel.
Rory McDonald, Government Outcomes Lab. I'm interested in how connected democracies are to your framework, or how connected your frameworks are to the democracy in the place. I'm aware that, like, Wales, for example, has a future well-being and Future Generations Act, and measurements happening, and it's quite open. So are democracies connected in the places that you've talked about? And then I'm also curious as to why they're not just buying more data and releasing it in the course of these contracts and these projects.
Thank you. Can I ask to spotlight the speakers that are online so that we can draw them in the conversation? So I'm asking for volunteer. Mika, which question would like to pick up?
I can try to answer two at the same time.
Two with one stone.
Yeah, I think that we must go beyond reports and we must start to deliver dynamic evaluation tools that can really serve decision making and also that can use up-to-date data. But where I disagree with Mathilde is that we can't continue to work only based on existing data. That's a big challenge in Finland. We have one of the best data banks in Finland, but still the Ministry of Economics said that before they didn't have this kind of information. For them, it was relevant to know whether the cost of a phenomena is this much or is it this much. And there I think that the point you mentioned about us being as interpreters, we must use the scientific understanding we have, but yet be creative. And as I've understood, that's something where evaluation happens. But if we stick too strictly in academic principles, we can't serve decision-making. We can't, that's my main point. And I think we must do it by creating dynamic evaluation tools, not reports. Yeah.
I can have a go at some of them as well. So we use the open data standards when we created our service directory. So we try to, where we can, find some of those top-down standards so that we can be as open and accessible as we can. So I do welcome standards and I do welcome the opportunity to use them. Many decision makers will want evidence that supports their decision rather than evidence that maybe drives their decision. So we do have to be careful with just assuming that decision makers want accurate information, because that's obviously not always the case. It's the old adage, you know, a drunk using a lamppost for support rather than illumination. And we see that all the way through kind of policy making and the kind of issue around what works to support my hypothesis is often the question, rather than, you know, what is the neutral evidence base for some of the decision making that we make. In terms of the democracy question, absolutely. In the devolved democracies, there are often much closer attention is paid to kind of family, child welfare outcomes, much more connectivity with the global frameworks that are out there as well for the protection of children, etc. I see that in this country, in the UK, more actively engaged in the devolved democracies than in kind of central Westminster government. So a closer focus on what legislation can do to kind of move the dial is quite an important thing as well. And did I miss anything? Was that it? I think I covered them all.
Thank you. Nanditi, raise your hand.
I had a question, but I'll just add something to what Mika said. You know, in terms of dynamic evaluation, we also need to have those processes for, you know, encouraging that we're going to fail. And you know, you need to learn and relearn, and that's why, you know, that whole learning, iterative learning is very important. But I think one of the cultural shift that really needs to take place in the public sector is like, you know, there's always this question of we can't take risks. You are taking more risk by not taking risks. So I think, you know, it's a very cultural shift, and it has to be come with certain, you know, understanding and cultural shift towards learning, dynamic evaluation, a combination of, you know, as I said, direct, indirect, and spillover measures. Like you really need to, and devolved arrangement. You can't do, and I think this is what you were saying, Nilima. I think the question is not about who has the bigger picture. Sometimes what we see is that who has the knowledge of bigger picture doesn't really understand what is happening on ground. So, and the question is it too much data or too little data? Do we need data at all for, you know, understanding every complexities on ground? So I think I'm going to leave that at a provocation stage, and that's it.
Thank you. I think there is a lively conversation online, but we are coming to the end of our session, and I committed to British punctuality. So for those of us here, we can continue the conversation in the forum. I would like to thank all the speakers for, as you might have noticed, they submitted the paper and they had a whole presentation. I told them like, no, I don't want to hear a presentation. I'm asking you a question and I want your experience on the thing that is in the presentation. So thank you so much for changing what you're presenting here today in order to fit an hour in a conversation, and to all the participants here in Oxford and online for a lively conversation. I have many takeaways on the importance of the dynamism and realizing how values is not something, it's not natural, neutral. Deciding which value to measure and how to measure is not a neutral exercise. There is an ethical dimension, has implication of what happens on the ground. And so we really need to think of the big picture. And often we get lost on like, how do I define a metric and what do I need to put in place? But actually, this has like major systemic implications, and the importance of having these loops to bring together the dynamism over time, because we need to keep up to date and learn from mistakes, and over space, because there are like central level, local level, global level, and how do you keep this going and fluctuating? So it's a great exercise. Thank you so much. I'll ask you for your feedback for every session. We want to make every conference and every session better than the previous one, so we value very much your feedback. But I pause here, and I remind you that what is coming up next is an official opening to the conference by the executive director of the GoLab, Nigel Ball, who is in the room with us right now, and a welcome to the school by the Dean of the school, Professor Nairi Woods, before we go on a keynote by Professor Julie Battilana, who will talk to us about the importance of understanding power if you want to create social change. So thank you so much to everybody.